I never expected a marriage proposal would lead to the unraveling of an entire family's facade. But there I was, standing between the towering shelves of rare books at Hartley's, watching my boyfriend of 2 years drop to one knee while his mother lurked in the shadows, ready to destroy everything. My name is Lila, and this is how I learned that some people will do anything to maintain their illusion of perfection. Lila Thompson, will you marry me? Emmett's voice carried through the quiet bookshop, his hands slightly trembling as he held up a vintage-style emerald ring. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, catching the stone's facets and sending green sparkles dancing across the spines of leather-bound classics. I barely managed to whisper, yes, before throwing my arms around his neck. This was perfect. He'd chosen the very spot where we'd first met, when I was reorganizing the classics section and he was searching for a first-edition Fitzgerald. I knew you'd say yes. He pressed his forehead against mine, grinning. Though I have to admit, I was terrified you might. How quaint. The voice cut through our moment like ice. Vivian Caldwell emerged from behind a bookshelf, her Hermes scarf perfectly draped, her expression a masterpiece of polite disdain. Emmett, darling, you really should have discussed this with the family first. I felt Emmett stiffen beside me. Mother, what are you doing here? Protecting my son's interests, naturally. She glided closer, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Miss Thompson, while I'm sure you're lovely, you must understand that marriage into the Caldwell family comes with certain expectations. Mother, stop. Emmett's voice carried a warning, but Vivian continued as if he hadn't spoken. Our family has maintained its position in society for generations. We have responsibilities, traditions. Her eyes swept over my simple sundress and worn sandals. It would be cruel to let you enter this arrangement without understanding the challenges you'll face. My cheeks burned, but I met her gaze. With all due respect, Mrs. Caldwell, I'm marrying Emmett, not his social calendar. A slight smile curved her lips. Oh, my dear. That's exactly the kind of naive thinking that concerns me. She reached into her designer handbag and withdrew an envelope. Perhaps you should read this before making any final decisions. It would be terrible to see you overwhelmed by circumstances you're not prepared for. Before either of us could respond, she pressed the envelope into my hands and turned to leave. Emmett, dinner at 7 on Sunday. Bring Miss Thompson, of course. We should all get to know each other better. The bell above the door chimed her exit. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery, covered in elegant handwriting. Dear Miss Thompson, consider this a friendly warning. I've watched many young women try to enter our world, thinking love conquers all. They learn quickly that love isn't enough when you're drowning in expectations you can't possibly meet. Save yourself the humiliation. Walk away now. Vivian Caldwell. Emmett took the letter from my trembling fingers and read it, his jaw tightening. I'm so sorry, Lila. She has no right. It's okay. I interrupted, though we both knew it wasn't. She's just trying to protect you. No, he said firmly, crumpling the letter. She's trying to control me. There's a difference. He took my hands in his. Look at me. Do you still want this? Us. I looked down at the emerald ring, now sitting perfectly on my finger, then back at the crumpled warning from his mother. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. Yes, I said, squeezing his hands. But your mother should know, I'm not as easily intimidated as she thinks. What I didn't say was that Vivian Caldwell had just made a crucial mistake. She'd shown her hand too early, and in doing so, she'd given me time to prepare for war. The Caldwell mansion loomed before us like something out of a Gothic novel, all stone and shadows in the fading Sunday light. I smoothed down my carefully chosen navy dress, expensive enough to show effort, modest enough to avoid criticism. At least, that's what I'd hoped. Ready. Emmett squeezed my hand as we approached the front door. Before I could answer, it swung open to reveal Harold Caldwell, his silver hair slightly disheveled, a drink already in hand. There's my boy, he said warmly, pulling Emmett into a quick embrace before turning to me. And the brave soul who's agreed to join our circus. His smile seemed genuine, but there was something sad in his eyes. The foyer opened into a great room that probably cost more than my parents' entire house. Vivian stood by a marble fireplace, orchestrating the scene like a conductor. Emmett, darling. And Lila. She managed to make my name sound like an afterthought. Agnes is running late, as usual. Actually, I'm right on time. A sharp voice cut through the tension. Agnes Caldwell appeared from another room, her white hair elegantly styled, her posture straight despite her age. She made her way directly to me, ignoring Vivian's outstretched arms. So you're the one who's got Vivian in such a state. Good. This family could use some shaking up. Vivian's smile tightened. Mother, please. Let's all sit down. Dinner is ready. The dining room could have seated 20, but we were arranged at one end of the massive table, making the space feel oddly intimate. A butler, an actual butler, began serving the first course. Tell me, Lila, Vivian started, delicately spooning her soup. What exactly do you do at that little bookshop? I'm the manager, actually. We specialize in rare books and first editions. Oh, how quaint. Though I suppose it's a step up from your mother's profession. Teaching at a public school must be so challenging. I felt Emmett tense beside me. Mother, it's fine, I interrupted, meeting Vivian's gaze. My mother loves teaching. She believes education should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their background. Agnes let out a small laugh. Well said, dear. Speaking of backgrounds, Vivian continued. Harold, didn't your firm just handle that dreadful scandal with the Thompson Construction Company? No relation, I hope? My spoon clattered against the bowl. That company belonged to my uncle, who'd recently been accused of fraud. The case had been settled quietly, but the implication was clear. Vivian had done her research. Actually, I said, keeping my voice steady, that was my uncle's company. The charges were dropped. After a substantial payment, as I recall, Vivian added sweetly. That's enough. Harold's voice carried unexpected authority. Vivian, you're being inappropriate. I'm simply trying to understand the kind of family our son is marrying into. Like you understood the kind of family you married into? Agnes's words landed like a bomb. The room went silent. Vivian's face paled. Mother, we agreed never to. No, you decided. I merely allowed it. But if you're going to sit here and judge this lovely young woman for her background, perhaps we should discuss yours. I think, Emmett said firmly, standing up, that Lila and I should go. Please stay, Harold said, but his eyes were on his wife. Vivian was just leaving to check on dessert, weren't you, dear? Vivian pushed back her chair with careful precision. Of course, though I doubt our guest has developed a taste for French pastries. After she left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Harold drained his glass. Agnes reached over and patted my hand. Don't let her scare you off, dear. Some people forget where they came from. Makes them terrified of anyone who reminds them. I nodded, my mind racing. What had Agnes meant about Vivian's background? And why had it rattled her so completely? Later, as Emmett drove us home, I thought about the letter in my purse, the barbs at dinner, and the strange tension between Agnes and Vivian. There was more to this family's story than anyone was saying. I'm sorry about tonight, Emmett said softly. Don't be. I touched the emerald ring on my finger. Your mother just taught me something valuable. What's that? Everyone has secrets. Even her. Agnes's phone call came at 3 a.m, her voice carrying a urgency that made my stomach drop. Meet me at the Silver Spoon Cafe at 7. Come alone. There are things you need to know about Vivian. I sat in the cafe now, watching Agnes slide into the booth across from me, looking far more serious than she had at dinner 3 nights ago. She placed a worn manila envelope on the table between us. Before I show you this, she said, I need to know if you're truly prepared for what fighting Vivian might mean. I'm not the one who started this fight. No, but you'll be the one to finish it. She pushed the envelope toward me. Vivian's been having you investigated, but 2 can play at that game. Inside were photographs, old ones yellowed with age. A young woman in a maid's uniform, standing outside what looked like a service entrance. It took me a moment to recognize Vivian's features in the girl's face. She was a maid, I whispered, at the Caldwell estate. That's how she met Harold. Agnes stirred her untouched coffee. She worked there for 3 years before they fell in love. His parents, my late husband and I, we opposed the marriage. My hands shook as I flipped through more photos. But you eventually accepted her? We did, which makes her current behavior all the more despicable. Agnes's voice hardened. She's become everything she once hated. Worse, she's trying to erase her past completely. A text message lit up my phone. Emmett, where are you? Mother's here at the bookshop. She's what? I stood up so quickly I nearly knocked over my coffee. I have to go. Lila. Agnes grabbed my wrist. Be careful. When Vivian feels cornered, she becomes dangerous. I rushed to the bookshop, finding Vivian examining our rare books section with exaggerated interest. Emmett stood nearby, looking uncomfortable. Ah, there you are, Vivian said without turning around. I was just telling Emmett about an interesting discovery. It seems someone has been accessing old Caldwell family records. Private ones. My heart pounded. Is that right? Indeed. Records about family history, employment records, old photographs. Now she turned, her eyes sharp as steel. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Mother, Emmett warned. No, let her answer. Have you been digging into my past, Lila? I thought about the photos in my bag. About Agnes's warning. About every subtle dig and veiled threat since the proposal. Actually, Mrs. Caldwell, I have a question for you. I moved closer, keeping my voice low. What was it like working as a maid? The color drained from her face. Behind her, Emmett's eyes widened. You have no idea what you're talking about, she hissed. I think I do. And I think I understand now. You're not afraid I'll embarrass the family. You're afraid I'll remind everyone of who you used to be. Lila. Emmett stepped forward. What's going on? Ask your mother about her time working at the Caldwell estate. Ask her why she's so desperate to hide it. Vivian's hand shot out, knocking over a display of first editions. Books crashed to the floor, one's ancient spine cracking on impact. You think you're clever? You think exposing this will help you? All you've done is ensure I'll never accept you into this family. Mother, stop. Emmett's voice cracked with shock. No, Emmett. She needs to understand. Vivian straightened her jacket, composure returning like a mask. I've worked too hard to build this life. I won't let some small-town nobody destroy it. The only one destroying anything is you, I said quietly, kneeling to pick up the damaged books. And for what? To protect a lie. Vivian's heel ground against one of the fallen books as she turned to leave. Consider this your final warning, Lila. Drop this, or I'll make sure you regret it. After she left, Emmett helped me collect the books, his hands trembling slightly. I had no idea, he whispered, about any of it. I showed him the photos, watched his face as he processed this new reality about his mother. What do we do now? He asked. Now. I carefully placed the damaged books on the counter. Now we show your mother exactly what happens when you underestimate someone you consider beneath you. The bridal boutique's mirror reflected everything I didn't want to see. My mother's worried expression, Agnes's tight-lipped concern, and most notably, the empty chair where my future mother-in-law should have been sitting. Instead, Vivian had sent her personal stylist, Marco, who circled me like a fashion-conscious vulture. Darling, this is... He gestured vaguely at my chosen dress, a vintage-inspired gown with delicate lace details. How do I put this diplomatically? It's very... You. That's kind of the point, I said, smoothing the fabric. It's my wedding dress. Mrs. Caldwell was quite specific about the image we're trying to achieve. He pulled out his phone, showing me a photo of a sleek, modern gown that probably cost more than my annual salary. This is what she had in mind. My mother stood up. I thought the bride usually chose her own dress. Oh, she does, Marco said with a practiced smile. Within reason. The Caldwell wedding will be covered by several society magazines. We have to maintain certain standards. The boutique door chimed, and Vivian swept in like she owned the place. Which, I realized with a sinking feeling, she probably did. I hope I haven't missed anything important. She air-kissed Marco's cheeks before turning to me. Oh dear, that's not the dress we discussed. No, I said firmly. It's the one I chose. Lila, darling, you don't understand. This wedding isn't just about you. It's about family tradition, about maintaining the Caldwell image. Like you maintained it? The words slipped out before I could stop them. The room went silent. Marco looked between us, sensing the tension but missing its source. Agnes gripped her cane tighter. I've been meaning to discuss that with you, Vivian said, her voice dangerously soft. Harold is quite upset about those old photos being circulated. He's considering postponing the wedding until we can be certain. Private matters remain private. My mother stood up. Are you threatening my daughter? Not at all. I'm simply explaining consequences. Vivian examined her manicure. Actions have them, you know. For instance, if certain stories about the Thompson family's financial troubles were to reach the press. That's enough. Agnes's voice cut through the tension. Vivian, you're embarrassing yourself. No, Mother, I'm protecting this family. Like I always have. She turned back to me. You have a choice, Lila. You can either play by the rules and join this family properly, or what? I challenged, though my voice shook. You'll reveal my family's struggles? Go ahead. Unlike you, I'm not ashamed of where I come from. Vivian's smile turned cruel. No. Then you won't mind if I share the real reason your uncle's company went under? The part about your father's involvement. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? Oh, you didn't know. Your father was on the board. He signed off on some very questionable contracts. The kind that could still lead to criminal charges, even now. The room spun. My mother's face had gone pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. "The dress arrives next week," Vivian continued as if she hadn't just dropped a bomb. "I trust you'll find it suitable." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Lila? Do give my best to your father. It would be terrible if his carpentry business suffered any legal complications." After she left, I sank onto the boutique's plush ottoman, still wearing the dress I'd loved just minutes ago. My mother's hands trembled as she called my father. "What do we do?" I asked Agnes. She reached into her purse and pulled out another envelope. "We use this. I wasn't going to show you yet, but..." She hesitated. "There's more to Vivian's past than just being a maid. Much more." I stared at the envelope, thinking about my father, about Vivian's threats, about Emmett caught in the middle of it all. "No," I said finally. "Not yet. First, I need to talk to my father. Then I need to see Harold." "Why Harold?" I stood up, carefully removing the dress I'd chosen. "Because before I destroy Vivian's carefully constructed world, I want to make sure I understand exactly what I'm dealing with." The game had changed. This wasn't just about standing up to Vivian anymore. It was about protecting my family while exposing hers. And I needed to be very, very careful about my next move. The cathedral's stained glass cast colored shadows across my wedding dress, Vivian's choice, not mine. I stood in the vestibule, watching guests file in through the massive doors, each face a reminder of how far this had spiraled from the intimate ceremony I'd wanted. "You look beautiful," my father said, his voice rough with emotion. We hadn't talked about what I'd learned, about his involvement with Uncle's company, about the contracts. He'd tried to explain, but I'd stopped him. Some truths were better faced after today. "Is everyone ready?" The wedding coordinator, another of Vivian's choices, appeared with her clipboard. "Mrs. Caldwell wants to begin." Of course she did. I caught a glimpse of her in the front pew, resplendent in pale blue Chanel, Harold notably absent from her side. He'd called in sick this morning, but the whispers about their recent arguments had already spread through both families. The music started. Not the piece I'd chosen, but something more traditional. More Caldwell appropriate. "Wait!" Agnes appeared, moving surprisingly quick for her age. "Lila, dear, you dropped this." She pressed something into my hand, a small, worn photograph. I recognized Vivian immediately, younger, standing in her maid's uniform. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. In the background, barely visible, a man who wasn't Harold. "Look closely," Agnes whispered. "And remember, you still have choices." Before I could respond, the wedding march began. My father squeezed my arm, and we started down the aisle. Emmett waited at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo, his smile genuine but strained. We'd barely spoken in the past week, both of us caught in the undertow of family politics. The ceremony passed in a blur until we reached the vows. As Emmett began to speak, Vivian stood up. "I apologize for the interruption," she announced, her voice carrying through the cathedral. "But before these vows are exchanged, there's something that needs to be addressed." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Emmett stepped forward. "Mother, don't." "I'm sorry, darling, but I can't watch you make this mistake." She turned to face the guests. "The Thompson family has been less than honest about their background. Mr. Thompson's involvement in a recent financial scandal. That's enough." The voice that cut through wasn't mine, but Harold's. He stood in the side entrance, looking disheveled but determined. "Vivian, sit down." "Harold, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." He moved down the aisle. "I understand that you're so terrified of losing control, you'd ruin our son's wedding day. Just like your father ruined ours." The photograph in my hand suddenly felt heavier. I looked at it again, at the man in the background. At Vivian's father. "Harold, please." Vivian's voice had lost its authority, replaced by something close to panic. "No." He reached the front, addressing the stunned guests. "My wife's father paid her to leave her first fiancé, a gardener's son, to marry me instead. She spent 30 years trying to erase that past, becoming exactly like the people who once looked down on her." Silence fell over the cathedral. I looked at Emmett, saw the shock on his face, then at Vivian, who had sunk back into her pew. "Now," Harold continued, "we can either continue this wedding, celebrating these two young people who actually love each other, or we can let history repeat itself. Your choice, Vivian." I felt Emmett's hand find mine. "Lila," he whispered, "we don't have to do this today. Not like this." I looked at the photograph one last time before slipping it into Vivian's lap as I passed her pew. "You're right," I said quietly. "We don't." The gasps returned as I turned and walked back down the aisle, my father's chosen dress trailing behind me. I heard Emmett's footsteps following, felt his hand catch mine again. "Where are we going?" he asked as we reached the doors. "To get married," I replied. "But on our terms, not theirs." Behind us, I heard Agnes's distinctive laugh, followed by the rustle of movement as she stood. "Well," her voice carried clearly, "I believe there's a lovely garden chapel just down the road. Shall we all redirect there? Except perhaps you, Vivian. I think you have some reflecting to do." Sometimes I realized the best revenge isn't about destroying someone's facade. It's about forcing them to face it themselves. The garden chapel reception was everything the cathedral ceremony wasn't: intimate, genuine, and completely out of Vivian's control. Which is probably why she showed up halfway through, clutching a manila envelope like a shield. "I tried to do this the gentle way," she announced, her entrance silencing the small crowd. "But you've left me no choice." Harold moved to intercept her. "Vivian, don't. Your precious Lila isn't who she claims to be." She pulled papers from the envelope, letting them scatter across the nearest table. "These are police reports. Sealed juvenile records. Did you know your bride was arrested at 16? My heart stopped. Emmett's hand tightened around mine. "It was expunged," I said quietly. "And it wasn't what you think." "No." Vivian's smile was razor-sharp. "Then explain why you were found in a burning building with gasoline on your hands." The reception fell silent. Even Agnes looked shocked. "I didn't," I started, but Vivian cut me off. "Your uncle's construction site. The one that burned down, leading to his first bankruptcy. The police suspected arson, didn't they? But Daddy covered it up, called in favors." "That's enough." My father stood up, his face ashen. "Is it? Because I think everyone deserves to know exactly who they've welcomed into their family. A troubled girl with a history of violence, whose father uses corrupt connections to." I was trying to save someone. The words burst out of me, echoing through the garden. There was a homeless man living in the building. I saw smoke, broke in to help him. The gas can was already there. "A convenient story," Vivian scoffed. "But the police report is incomplete." Agnes's voice cut through the tension. She stood slowly, leaning on her cane. "Because I made sure of it." Everyone turned to stare at her. Even Vivian looked confused. "What are you talking about, Mother?" "That homeless man? He was your father, Vivian. After he lost everything, after he forced you to marry Harold, he lived on the streets. I kept track of him, tried to help when he'd let me." Agnes moved closer to me. "The night of the fire, he'd been drinking, knocked over a space heater. Lila saved his life." The color drained from Vivian's face. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Check the hospital records from that night. John Morrison, admitted for smoke inhalation. He died 3 months later from pneumonia." Agnes turned to me. "I never knew it was you. Not until I saw your juvenile record in Vivian's research." The garden spun around me. All this time, all these weeks of Vivian's attacks, and I'd been connected to her past in ways none of us knew. "Why didn't you tell me?" Vivian's voice cracked. "About father? Would it have changed anything?" Agnes asked. "Would knowing he died alone, ashamed of what he'd forced you to become, have made you treat Lila any differently?" Vivian staggered back, bumping into a table. Flowers and champagne glasses crashed to the ground. "I think," Harold said quietly, "it's time you left." "Harold, now, Vivian, before you destroy what's left of this family." As she fled the garden, I felt the weight of every secret, every manipulation, every moment of the past few months crushing down. The man I'd tried to save had been Vivian's father. The same man who'd forced her into a loveless marriage, setting off decades of bitterness and control. "Lila." Emmett's voice seemed far away. "Are you okay?" I wasn't. None of this was okay. The truth about my past was out, tangled impossibly with Vivian's own tragedy. I'd wanted revenge, wanted to expose her hypocrisy, but not like this. Not through the death of her father, a death she hadn't even known about. "I need some air," I managed, pulling away from Emmett's grasp. As I walked toward the chapel's small prayer garden, I heard Agnes following. "You're not responsible for any of this," she said softly. "Aren't I?" I pushed and pushed, wanting to hurt her like she hurt me. "And now we all have to live with the truth," Agnes finished. "The question is, what will you do with it?" I looked back at the reception, at my new family scattered among overturned flowers and scattered police reports, and realized I had no idea how to fix what had been broken, or if it even could be fixed. I found Vivian in her father's old groundskeeper's cottage, now a storage shed on the edge of the Caldwell estate. She sat among dusty furniture and forgotten memories, clutching a faded photograph. "I used to hide here," she said without looking up, "when Father would drink. Before he arranged my marriage to Harold. Agnes told me where to find you." I stepped inside, letting the door close behind me. "The family's worried." "Are they?" She laughed bitterly. "Harold's already filed for divorce. Agnes has cut off my access to the family accounts. Even my own son." She trailed off, finally meeting my eyes. "Why are you here, Lila?" "Because I understand now. About wanting to erase the past." "Do you?" She stood, swaying slightly. An empty wine bottle rolled across the floor. "You have no idea what it's like spending decades building a life, only to have it all unravel because of where you came from." "Actually, I do. You made sure of that when you exposed my juvenile record. That was different. Was it? Or were you just doing to me what your father did to you? Forcing someone to be something they're not, because you're terrified of facing who you really are." She moved suddenly, grabbing a stack of papers from a nearby table. "You want to know who I really am? Here." She thrust them at me. "Bank statements. Property deeds. Everything Harold's lawyers sent over. I'm broke, Lila. Everything belongs to the family trust. Without the Caldwell name, I'm nothing again. You were never nothing. Easy for you to say. You're young, talented. You have Emmett's love, my mother's approval. I have." She gestured around the cottage. "Ghosts." I picked up the photograph she'd dropped. A young Vivian in her maid's uniform, smiling genuinely at someone off camera. "You had love once, too. Before your father made you give it up. The gardener's son," she whispered. "Thomas. He wanted to open a flower shop. What happened to him? He died. Car accident, 2 years after I married Harold." Her voice cracked. "I never even said goodbye." The cottage fell silent except for the distant sound of cars on the main road. Somewhere in the estate, a dinner party would be starting. The first one Harold had hosted without Vivian. "I came here to tell you something," I said finally. "Agnes is transferring ownership of my bookshop to me. She's been the silent owner all along." Vivian stiffened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it needs a business manager. Someone who understands both worlds, literature and high society. Someone who knows how to run things properly." "You can't be serious." "I am. But there are conditions." I met her gaze steadily. "No more manipulation. No more hiding from who you are or where you came from. And you'll need to work with my father. He's designing the new reading room." She sank back into her chair. "Harold would never allow it. Harold doesn't own the bookshop. And he doesn't own you anymore either." The sound of footsteps outside made us both turn. Agnes stood in the doorway, leaning on her cane. "Well," she asked, "have you two figured it out yet?" Vivian looked at the photograph, then at me. "Why would you help me? After everything I've done?" "Because sometimes the best revenge is giving someone the chance to become who they should have been all along." I held out my hand. "What do you say? Ready to start over?" She stared at my hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached for it. But instead of shaking it, she pressed the photograph into my palm. "Keep this," she said quietly, "to remind us both what happens when we let fear of the past destroy our future." Agnes smiled, stepping aside as we walked out of the cottage together. Behind us, the sun was setting over the estate, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn where Vivian's father had once worked, where she had once fallen in love, and where she'd finally, after all these years, found her way back to herself. "You know," she said as we walked, "I actually do know quite a bit about rare books." "I know," I replied. "That's not why I offered you the job." "Then why?" "Because everyone deserves a second chapter." 6 months after our Garden Chapel wedding, I stood in the newly renovated reading room of my bookshop, watching Vivian arrange a display of first editions. Her hands moved with surprising gentleness over the aged spines, treating each book like a precious artifact rather than a status symbol. "The Thomas Hardy collection arrived," she said without looking up. "I've already had 3 inquiries from serious collectors." My father paused in his work, hanging the last of the custom-built shelves he'd designed. The wood inlays in these cases would complement them nicely. Vivian nodded, actually smiled. "They would. You have quite an eye for detail, George." The bell above the door chimed, and Harold walked in, looking somewhat out of place in his expensive suit. He'd started dropping by occasionally, usually when he knew Vivian would be here. They weren't reconciling, some bridges stay burned, but they'd found a way to exist in the same space without hostility. "The reading room looks remarkable," he said, running a hand along one of the shelves. "Though I suspect it's not what brought you here today." "No," Harold admitted. I wanted to let you know personally, Vivian. The divorce is final. The room went still. My father quietly gathered his tools and slipped out, leaving us alone with the weight of the moment. Vivian's hands trembled slightly as she placed the last book in the display. I suppose that's that, then. I suppose it is. Harold hesitated. You seem, well, I am. Better than I've been in years, actually. She gestured around the shop. Turns out there's something liberating about starting over. The door chimed again. Emmett and Agnes entered, carrying takeout bags from the cafe down the street. Family lunch? Emmett asked, then noticed his father. Oh, Dad. I didn't know you were coming by. Just leaving, actually. Harold nodded to everyone, lingering a moment longer than necessary before heading out. We gathered around the reading room's central table, passing around containers of food. Agnes insisted on using proper plates. Some habits die hard. While Vivian surprised everyone by eating her sandwich with her hands. You know, Agnes said, watching her daughter, I found something interesting in the old estate records. She pulled out a worn envelope. The deed to that flower shop Thomas wanted to open. Your father bought it to ensure it would never succeed. Vivian set down her sandwich. Why are you telling me this now? Because the property's still in the family trust. And as trustee, I've decided to sell it. Agnes slid the envelope across the table. To you if you want it. I don't understand. The bookshop is doing well, I added. Well enough to expand. We've been talking about adding a rare botanical book section, maybe some actual flowers to complement the space. Vivian opened the envelope with shaking hands, staring at the old deed. Thomas always said books and flowers were the perfect combination. Beauty for both mind and soul. He wasn't wrong, Emmett said softly. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, I found Vivian in the reading room, placing a framed photograph on the wall, the one of her in her maid's uniform, smiling at the unseen Thomas. Are you sure you want to display that? I asked. It's time to stop hiding who I was. She straightened the frame. Besides, it's a good reminder that sometimes the things we think will destroy us actually set us free. I thought about revenge, about justice, about how neither had turned out quite the way I'd expected. You know, when this all started, I wanted to make you pay for trying to keep Emmett and me apart. And now I think maybe we both needed to lose everything to find something better. She turned from the photograph, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I found another letter from my father yesterday, hidden in the cottage. He wrote it the night before he died in that hospital. Would you like to read it? I looked at the envelope she held out, thinking about choices, about cycles of pain, about the fine line between justice and mercy. No, I said finally. Some stories belong just to us. But I'm here if you want to talk about it. She nodded, tucking the letter away. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the reading room's new windows. They fell across the books, the wooden shelves, the photograph of a younger Vivian. All pieces of a story that had turned out so differently than any of us had planned. Lila. Vivian's voice was quiet. Thank you for giving me a better ending than the one I deserved. Maybe it's not an ending, I replied. Maybe it's just a different kind of beginning,